I'd like to thank the three curators of the collection, and especially David Elmer for inviting me to speak. I first ran into David 7 years ago through email correspondence. We've only just met, but he's been very helpful over the years with incisive feedback on questions I've had, and also supplying me with material from the collection, so I'm very grateful for that. Yes, and I also want to be the first one to point out that I am not an expert in any of the areas I'm going to be speaking about. Really what's needed, what we need is an ethnomusicologist with South-Slavic dialectology, as well as computer programming and statistics. I know nothing about any of those, so. But the questions I'm interested in about the South-Slavic material I've not heard asked in enough detail, and I haven't seen answers for the questions. So I'm going to ask the questions in hopes of receiving some input and ideas from all of you. And hopefully someone else with more abilities, or maybe a team of people with abilities, will emerge someday. So like many, I suppose, from Milman Parry onwards, I came to the South Slavic material from classics and with an interest in Homer. And my specific interest was in trying to understand the nature of oral epic singing in a period before an imported pan-Near Eastern tuning tradition, which is what I studied in my doctoral research. So I looked to the South Slavic material as some sort of analogy for what Homer might have been and what sort of contrast we could have drawn with this other art. Now, this conference is ample witness to the use that's been made of the South Slavic material, but for the most part, the musical dimension has remained unexplored in a technical sense or systematically. Of course, the use of diction, formulaic diction, and placement of formula has been well studied. Patterning of accents, Professor Foley and others. Roman Jakobson has argued for the Indo-European basis of the Desiderats, which, as far as I know, is widely accepted by Indo-Europeanists. So there's been a lot of work done on this aspect of the musical tradition, and of course an appreciation for the fact that it is a musical form and the context of the performance and so on. This has been very well and carefully studied. But the actual melodic art, that is the use of pitch and time, have been studied not as deeply, even though this is an essential component of the overall art. And as we've seen in some of the papers already, it's integral to the other aspects which have been studied, and facilitates, possibly in some way, composition and performance and what I would like to call musical cognition, the thought processes that go into composing and performance, and how they can be stimulated and enhanced and enabled by the musical act itself. Now this has not really been looked at too carefully. The two famous attempts, of course, are Bartok and later Stephen Erdely from MIT. I don't know if he's here, or even if he's still alive. I don't know if anyone knows. Beg pardon?
I think he's not alive.
Okay. He was? Okay, well, so nobody really knows. Yeah. The other was George Herzog, who began to transcribe the heroic songs until Bartok arrived, and he yielded the floor, I suppose, turned the task over to maybe in deference to Bartok, or I'm not sure what exactly. And if anyone knows where those transcriptions are, I'd like to know. Apparently they're not in the collection here. So let's start by appreciating what Bartok did. Now, I want to make clear from the start that I have nothing but admiration for Bartok's transcriptions or those of Erdely, and they contribute importantly. And we'll look at both what they contribute and what their limitations are. But if you went to the exhibition last night and you saw Bartok's manuscript of these transcriptions, my goodness, I was blown away. I've seen the images, of course, and I've seen the printed edition in the Serbo-Croatian heroic songs, but to actually see his minuscule hand carving precisely and deeply into the paper is really astonishing. So here we go. Okay, so a transcription is a form of translation, and translation theory tells us that you can only achieve equivalence on certain registers depending on how you choose to approach it. So we will wonder how and why Bartok took the job on as he did. And we're fortunate enough to have some information about how he regarded it. It would be nice to have more, but this is one of the more extensive passages. It's from the collection of women's songs, and the important point that is here is that he insists that the only real notation of the music is the recording itself, and this is important. This is the point that Parry had in mind when recording, was to avoid the editorial interventions of earlier collectors. But necessarily to represent the music onto the page is an editorial intervention that interferes with what's actually there. But of course, Bartok was practical. He has this brilliant image of we could simply photograph the grooves of the record and that would be it. And in a way, he's right, and this is what I'll come back to proposing myself later on. But at the time, he had to be practical, and he said that even though there's limitations, even given the innovative signs that he'll use, nevertheless, these transcriptions can be useful according to our purpose. What then was his purpose? Well, we get some information in the correspondence between Herzog and Lord. Herzog noted that Bartok was taking down every possible fly speck in the music, and that's abundantly clear from the transcription. And he'll let up on it sooner or later, so even Bartok could not sustain the pace forever. He was trying to make a point, and he wasn't going to do it forever. And in fact, in the published version, he leaves out large swathes of verses which he says are similar to previous ones. But something I'm interested in is how similar are they and what are the differences? And how can we measure those? So those are not included. And then, of course, the famous letter to Kadai, where he talks about his wonder at discovering this last vestige of minstrelsy in his backyard. This really shows the gap between the tradition and the larger culture that goes back probably to the Middle Ages, this the class distinction with regard to the tradition. And you get the impression that he was so blown away by this that he wanted to celebrate it and represent it in all its otherness and glory. And to a certain extent, we can probably suppose that he was enjoying flexing his own muscles and his own ability to represent this so complexly. It looks more like his own modern compositions or those of Stravinsky and other composers at the time. Let's look at some of what he had to do or what he chose to do. First, we can note the complex rhythmic notation of triplets of eighths, of quarters and half notes. This idea of triplets only makes sense against a background rhythm from which they can be in triple multiples. But the idea of a continuous background rhythm does not really square with the South-Slavic singing, where tempo fluctuates so widely, and even rhythms within the decasyllable. So he could not really have maintained this system indefinitely because he would have run out of values to accurately reflect it. But by making it as complex as this, I think he was celebrating how very different it was from what's represented by conventional notation and its independence, its otherness from what we're used to. The same goes with regard to the dimension of pitch, this remarkable key signature of two flats and a sharp in which both the flats are given microtonal deviations. And this is quite astonishing. And then, of course, all these other deviations that are not within that key signature. So what this, I think the great achievement and the legacy of this was he demonstrated that there was something very complex and systematic about it that really was different from the tradition, the Western tradition, if that's not quite the right word, Western, but which underlies conventional staff notation. And he achieved a high ideal of accuracy. He effectively represented the curves of the disc as accurately as humanly possible given conventional notation. But by rendering it so complexly, he obscured the simpler underlying patterns which unite this musical form. And by going so deeply into the fly specks, he was unable to go over long enough stretches to uncover more long-range tendencies in the music. So this is where the transcriptions of Erdely served as a welcome corrective. And he, if you may be familiar, he transcribed 3 complete epics from volume 14 of Serbo-Croatian heroic songs. And he adopted almost the opposite strategy. He wanted to get as much there as possible, and so he had to simplify. And in so doing, he highlighted the underlying patterns instead of obscuring them. So just to take one example of how he discusses his strategy, tempo. Rather than indulging in what Bartok has with these complex triplets, he prefers to use only a few values, quarters and eighths and sometimes sixteenths, to show relative values to each other. He doesn't insist that a quarter is always twice the length of an eighth. He simply says that it's longer. And he also says that given tempo fluctuations, these values will be continuously changing so that none of these notes have any absolute value at all. And not only that, he will combine 2 methods, the one I've just described, and so he's combining representing the decasyllable in simplified units with giving more complex notations of variety as it goes along. So he's trying to have it both ways. Here's what it looks like. It ends up looking, it's misleading because we don't really know the true value of any of those notes. If we could hear the sound recording, we'd have a better idea, but, and I hope these recordings will be made available online soon because that would be great to have this all together. But here he gives us what the range of metronome values these notes can have. You can see from here. So in terms of rhythm, it shows the ebb and flow of the music. It does not obscure the pattern basis of repeating decasyllables, but it reveals quite a lot that Bartok could not as a result. But it doesn't let us come to very close grips with time patterning, especially internal time patterning. Given a decasyllable at a different tempo at a different place, what are the internal time relations of those notes? Also of interest, he has notated out the tambura part, which as a fixed tuning instrument is constant. But he also revealed that against this, the intonation of some of the phrases tends to wander, and sometimes we get these very interesting, what he calls polytonal effects. He cites an interesting case where the singer apparently, through fatigue, has dropped the entire intonation to a lower key. The key is something that might be implied by a fixed-stringed instrument, but this is now not in that key, it's somewhere else. So there's some clash there, and there's the question, does the instrument solely serve as rhythm, or does its conflicting pitch create some intentional clash that can echo the point of the song or the point of the arc of emotion of the singer? So there's an area that has not been explored as far as I know. He also refers to unsettled pitch. Well, I want to know what those pitches are. I'm sure there's places where it's relatively indefinable, but I think we can do better than that. So his approach, to summarize, it was macroscopic and it revealed these long-term tendencies and strategies for variety. And here's some of his list. The singer seems to freely alternate between modal notes, or he'll have a pattern of 4 or 5 pitches, and then one will change, and then another will change. And even the final note, seemingly what we would predict as a tonic, can change. And that'll change the entire modal character of the preceding tone set. Modulations into different modes I've mentioned, and these polytonal effects. So he noted these and he documented them, but what we still haven't got is a logic behind them, if there is one, the degree to which they're intentional or accidental under pressure of the moment. And I've already touched on the limitations of the method. There's also some conceptions or preconceptions that he has which are a little obscuring. One of this is his description of the melodies as predominantly diatonic. This means in loose usage, tones and semitones. And I find that musicologists and ethnomusicologists tend to use this term more loosely than we do in studying ancient music, ancient Greek music, which is where the term diatonic comes from, diatonos. He seems to, this paragraph seems to justify his use of the staff, and he says, only occasionally do the tones deviate, and then I'll mark them with an arrow, and even then they don't deviate any more than an eighth or a quarter of a tone. Hardly more than an eighth or a quarter. The misconception here is that diatonos, this form of music, is, I've argued elsewhere, the result of a very specific musical technology. In the case of Greece, we can illustrate it through the lyre, but it requires an instrument with 7 or more sounding bodies. We can contrast this with the guzli, where there's 1. So we have to wonder, in this case, in the mind of the singer, is there a conception of diatonic? Is there a conception of tonal continuum divided in these tones and semitones? If there's not, what conception is there? And I'll note that the quarter tone is the maximal deviation within diatonic tuning. That is, Erdely treats it as inconsequential, and yet that's the farthest you can get away from diatonic tuning. And it's precisely within this range that the ancient Greek theorists are discussing and debating about exact measurements of their singing. So this is exactly where we're interested in having more precise measurements and where we're not getting them. So Bartok himself was aware of this problem, and he, this famous statement that I think should be the template for further research, he asserts that these deviations show a certain system. They're subconsciously intentional and must not be considered faulty off-pitch singing. And he contrasts it with the accidental off-pitch singing of urban amateurs and the self-assured, self-conscious, decided performance of peasant singers. Now, quite how he understands the contrast between subconsciously intentional and self-assured and self-conscious, I'm not sure, but that's interesting. He also says quite clearly that he would like to know what this material is. Exact measurements would be highly interesting and would give us information about their constancy, that is to say, intentionality. But while noting that this sort of measurement is now possible in his time, regrets that he's not had a chance to do it. But he quite clearly says that this is something we want to do. Let's skip over that there. So I think we need to, and we're at the point in history where we can return to the originally stated ideal of Bartok, which is to reproduce the curves of the phonograph recordings. Now, we still can't literally do that or it would be unintelligible, but we have other ways to visually render information now. So I think what we need to do is take the positive aspects of both methods and synthesize them into a new method. We want Bartok's level of accuracy and his stated goals, his desiderata. We want to realize those. But we need the macroscopic ability and flexibility of Erdely. At the same time, we must absolutely avoid the constraints of conventional notation and look instead to means of pattern-based analysis, both in the dimensions of pitch and time. And the essential part of this is we want random access ability to the material so that we can look for patterns that are not linear. This is on the assumption that there's some formulaic nature also to the melodic language that's cognate with the formulaic nature of the diction. It's an untried assumption, but I think we want to look at that. So some of the things that we can hope to get are precise microtonal measurements. If anyone has done this, I'd like to know about it. I don't know about it. We want to study precisely the harmonic contents of these pitch sets, something which we could put under the loose heading of modality, modal weighting, which notes are given more weight at which points. We can also maybe benefit, have a greater understanding of how singers approach these sort of structures, these isosyllabic, what Professor Foley calls right justified in terms of the quantification. These are the features that Indo-Europeanists see surviving into the decasyllable. That may or may not be true, but if it is true, we want to know more about it, and we want to know how the singers conceive of the give and take throughout the decasyllable. This will give us, hopefully, an insight into understanding how similar patterns in Vedic and early Greek poetry work. At least it will be a very suggestive analogy. And we, again, want to look for the possible formularity or formulaic status of melodic language. Lord suggested that the instrument and vocal part tended to stay together in the first half of the decasyllable and then diverge slightly after that. I haven't seen any careful study of this on the melodic register, but it is parallel to the colonic structure of the verse itself, so we want to look at that. So overall, we want to elaborate a system that can explain this as a process rather than a product, again, to use Professor Foley's terms. Erdely gave us 3 epics, but again, it's not the specific realization of any of these 3 epics that's really the most interesting thing for me. It's what is the system of rules or the grammar which allows those 3 epics to have been spun out as they were and are likely to be different next time around. I want to know the underlying impulses. I think this relates to famous descriptions of epic song as the same thing over and over again, but it really gets to what is different about it being the same over and over. There's the famous statement of Crochet about the medieval French epics, that the same song must be sung over and over again. Now, this might be understood as a distance listener making a statement about the tedium of this kind of music, especially in this passage where he notes that this sort of music is sung to the poor and the infirm. One of the passages we have that shows the decadence, or the, let's say not the decadence, the moribund nature of the tradition already in the medieval period, at least in this part of Europe. But I think it's possible to see it as an internal concept if we can use this parallel from Greece. This is an inscription from Epidavros, probably Hellenistic. It's a hexametric hymn to Asclepios, and it's given 1 line of musical notation. And Martin West has, I think, given the convincing interpretation that this is meant to be a modal formula which will be elaborated through some set of unwritten rules in performance. I think that's likely. And so if that's the case, we have within a tradition, we have the self-description of music as the same thing over and over. But it's assumed that everyone knows that that's not actually the case. So how can we proceed? Well, we have to make some use of pitch analysis. This is a trivial matter using phonetic software. We can extract exact pitch measurements from any pitched material. That's not a problem. The problem is rather to link this material to the textual material, because otherwise the melodic content is divorced from the rest of its presumably cognate material. There's, I imagine, a variety of ways to do this. One way that I've uncovered, I think is viable, I'll present it here, was developed by a researcher at the Oregon Graduate Institute who's a specialist in speech recognition, Paul Hosum. And this is his recent paper on the topic. So in collaboration with him, and I'd like to say that at this point, most of what you'll see is his intellectual property. This would be the process. You'd start with a text. So we would need electronic text corpora, which we have. Professor Foley has. There's also Kenneth Goldman is in the room, in the 1970s, did 8 songs by Avdo Avdic using IBM punch cards. I don't know how many years that took, but it was a year and a half, right. So imagine your research consists of data entry for a year and a half before you know if you have any results. So that's a heroic undertaking. But that electronic corpus still survives, and Dr. Goldman has recovered that from magnetic tape recently. There's a concordance and the electronic texts. So you need an electronic text. You then need to extract a lexicon of all the words that occur in that text and all the forms of the words. That's also trivial. Then you create a phoneticized lexicon. So you have a database of phonetic values which then translate the lexicon into a string of phonetic values which are symbolized in various ways. The lexicon that Dr. Hosum has is optimized for American English, so it would have to be trained for Serbo-Croatian dialects, but that's relatively easy because we have straightforward sound correspondences with orthography, even if it varies by region. So then from the lexicon, you develop a phoneticized text. You have your sound file, and then his software goes from one to the other, and it looks up the words in the sound file. It goes through the sound file looking for a certain sequence of sounds and referring back to its database, its lexicon, and then matching them. And the output can be fed back into the lexicon to streamline and make more accurate the identification process. Now, he estimates that we would need 10 occurrences of every phoneme in combination with 8 other classes of articulation, both before and after. But this is a relatively small amount of data and should be achievable. Then you do your pitch extraction, and you link them together in a final output, and you end up with something that could look like this. You have your decasyllable divided into cells where your melodic material is cellularized, and then you can, say, create a concordance of melodic material. For instance, you could examine formulae of diction and see if there's any correlation with formulae of melody or not. Or you could look at melodic patterns at certain places in the verse. All sorts of applications. So the technical issues. First of all, there's the noise of the guzle. Fortunately, when Parry and Lord recorded, as far as I can tell, and Peter's presentation was very helpful for this, as well as a picture that was in the exhibition last night, as far as I can tell, he mostly was concerned to capture the voice, and the guzle is usually somewhat in the background. In the trial run that we did, it was enough in the background that it did not obscure the voice. So the computer was able to do the speech recognition, and the guzle did not interfere, fortunately. And I was also glad to see the Albanian field work that was being done with 2 microphones to separate the 2 aspects of the sound, because really you want to know what they're both doing. You can also use the program to automate identification of noise areas. So if there is a place where the guzle masks the voice and creates a false identification, you can search for time values of syllables to look for something that's an abnormal length in relation to surrounding sounds, and that'll help you identify the problem areas. Now, of course, I think the bigger problem is the gap between the transcriptions and the sound files. We need accurate transcriptions to do an accurate match, and this is not always the case. The performatives have been left out. Words have been complemented or supplemented where the singer has swallowed the sounds. Those will create false identifications. Normalization of diction. So to do this, you would need somebody that really knew the language well, of course. But just to show a trial run of this, I take this song. It's track 10 from the 2nd edition of Singer of Tales. I don't have the singer and the title because I could no longer run the disc on my Macintosh now. It only runs on Classic, so if anyone knows, that would be helpful. But here's the first little bit of the song. Okay, so here's how it works. The lexicon is created where every word in the sample is given a phonetic realization. This is using a system called WorldBet, which is simply a shorthand way of, it replaces IPA symbols, but it's the same values. It's a more user-friendly transliteration. Here's the text written into that format. Pause and garbage here. These are spaces between words. They could be silence, or it could be other kind of background noise, which he's calling garbage here. It doesn't look much like the original text, but that's the transliteration convention. Here's a case where he listened first to the sound recording and did just a very rough tweaking of his program. He removed these syllables that had been put into the transcription, which were not audible in the sound file. And he also changed some of the American values to his database to what sounded from the sound file. So C was no longer C, but T, and that sort of thing. And so he runs the program, identifies each of the phonemes, gives a start time and an end time. And this can be represented graphically. So the bottom is what the program yielded. And in this instance here, we had some false identifications. And he corrected it manually to this in the middle by listening, and also you develop an intuition for what the spectrum looks like, what an R looks like. And he thinks in this case the false positive was created by the difference between the Serbo-Croatian R and the American R, or possibly noise from the guzle. So this is a very first run. It's not particularly accurate, but the next little bit was quite accurate. So it's quite hopeful that this could work quite well and automate the process of transcription very efficiently. So I really don't know what all the applications of this could be. I have the questions I'm interested in. They may prove to be meaningless questions. They may prove to be more interesting. But ideally, I envision a tool in which different researchers can query of the material what they're interested in, and hopefully new facets will come out. Ideally, it'll be something of the sort like a multi-text Homer project or Professor Foley's project, linked through precisely to the texts, where you could be given a musical rendition and you could follow formularity between singers. Within a singer, you'd obviously want to start with a single singer and see what his grammar is, but it'd be interesting to look for regional connections and so on. The user wants to be able to specify tolerances. In other words, let's say you're interested, as Erdely was, in giving a more or less equal-tempered rendition so you can grasp in big terms what's happening. That should be allowed. You should be able to say, look within this range of hertz, or within this range of cents, a hundredth of a tone. Maybe you're interested in the exact measurement. Then you want to be able to get it right down to the hertz. So all that should be possible. Concordance functions I've mentioned. These other things on the screen I've touched upon in various ways, but I'd be very curious to hear if anybody can think of something that this method might give to them and any problems they might foresee in implementing it. And I should finish by saying that this is very much an ideal. It would take a lot of time, strength, cash, and patience, and quite a few people. So it's, but I think it's encouraging that it's possible, and I think we should at least keep in mind that this is what Bartok would want us to do. So thank you very much.